All right. So today we are looking at Heidi Hermery's book, Working with Nature Shifting Paradigms. We are going to go for a deeper dive into the soil chapters in particular. That's the text there from Gaia College. And in particular, we're looking at chapter 5 here today. All right, so a little bit of context before we jump in. When we look at regenerative farming approach, soil fertility is a result of a balanced soil ecology, a healthy soil food web. I'm hoping that you guys have come across that term before, soil food web. The simplified version is like that food chain that we all learned back in grade school, where one thing eats the other and this and that. But with the soil food web, it gets a little bit more involved, where you're looking at not only the food chain as the above ground kind of things, but you're also looking at everything that's involved in the soil and how that relates into the food chain. There's all sorts of interesting diagrams online about this. Here is one here with from the Soil Solution Group. Another one here from the Soil Food Web. Elaine Ingram is her name, who first kind of came up with these concepts and introduced them decades ago, and people have run with it. Here's another one here. This one I particularly like, but it's a terrible image. So let's go this way and visit this image here. All right. Here you can see how, just like how we've been talking so far, that in a properly functioning ecosystem, everything's waste is somebody else's food. And that's exactly what the soil food web is trying to demonstrate. The plants rely on all these different things in order to grow, really, and you can say the same thing about the animals rely on all these different things in order for their optimal growth. And you can tune into anything here. All the nematodes rely on everything else. The protozoa rely on everything else. Everything is interdependent. You have all these different functions being taken care of in the ecosystem by the various macro and microorganisms in the ecosystem. You have the photosynthesizers, you have the decomposers, you got the root feeders, the shredders, the predators, the grazers. You can read all this for yourself. But everybody has a role to perform in a healthy ecosystem. It's our job as regenerative farmers to create the habitat that all of these different functional groups can do their function. Anytime we take away, say, the organic debris from our beds, from our garden beds, we are depriving some other organism of that food. And anytime we do that, then all of a sudden our job as a farmer now has become more cumbersome. Now, since we have deprived that series of organisms of food, it's up to us then to go in there and then replenish that. Where if we have a properly functioning ecosystem, as opposed to a collection of garden plants, that's what we're trying to avoid. If we have a properly functioning ecosystem in our garden, all of these different organisms are feeding each other, and our job as a farmer gets a lot easier. All right, so that's the soil food web. I didn't intend to spend too much time on there. I'm hoping that's not a very new concept to a whole lot of people, but it makes good sense, right? Everything feeds each other. Another bit of context here, soil management is relationship management. That's exactly what I was kind of getting at with all those different functioning groups in a healthy functioning ecosystem. If you can manage everybody's relationships in that ecosystem, allowing everybody to have that food that creates waste for somebody else, the soil management takes care of itself.
Have you guys been able to, are you guys hearing Mark okay? No. They are not. Do you want to use my computer? Mark, you can.
All right, I think we're back. All right, soil management, relationship management. Every landscape is unique, every garden is unique. There is no one series of tasks that can be prescribed to every single garden. It's up to you to be able to kind of read your garden ecosystem and figure out what kind of tweaks need to be made here and there. Okay, so with the regenerative farming approach, what we're trying to do is create the conditions that allow all of those various communities of organisms, those different functioning groups of organisms that are present in the soil to do their job. Ideally, if you're doing things right, you shouldn't need to get out there and till the soil all that much. If you're able to create the right conditions, the earthworms will do most of that heavy work for you. You can have a whole army of earthworms tilling the soil and doing a much better job than you could possibly do with a rototiller at that, because they're not disturbing that top layer as much and drying out the soil. The earthworms, if you create the right conditions, can do a lot of the heavy lifting there for you. And then under the right conditions, if you're able to create that functioning ecosystem that we're trying to strive for, you can greatly reduce the need for external fertilizer inputs. So, as I've been saying, there is no series of tasks that fits every single garden, every single ecosystem. What we're trying to do is to create the right conditions. And Heide here in her soil chapter identifies 4 different ways to create those right soil conditions. She talks about supplementing missing essential nutrients, providing the appropriate organic matter for soil organisms, increasing soil biodiversity, and stimulating biological processes. Now, she notes that not any one of them are more important than the other. Each one is required for a healthy functioning ecosystem. Before we jump into kind of going through each of those 4 categories, let's do a brief kind of soil 101 recap. Make sure we're all have the kind of same concepts down about soil and talking about the same thing here. Heide likes to say that soil is the result of interaction between 3 equal partners. I introduced a little bit of these concepts to you guys about 2 weeks ago when we did our book overview. She talks about the abiotic components of the soil, which is your sand, silt, clay, and mineral nutrients. Basically rock that has been broken down and eroded over time. She talks about the living organisms in the soil, the various animals, plants, and microbes. And then talks about the environmental components that make up soil too, which is the temperature, air, and water. And the interplay between them is what creates soil. So here is that soil triangle. We've looked at this before. Sand, silt, and clay each bring different qualities to the soil partnership. They will, having more or less sand, more or less silt, more or less clay will affect your soil density, how much water your soil can hold, and the electrical nutrient holding qualities. Now, I've stayed away so far from talking much about the electrical nutrient holding capacity for various soils, but we're going to get down into that a little bit today. And this is actually where the abundant clay soil here at Hayes Farm actually looks as if, hey, maybe we got something. It's clay, clay soils that hold all the electrical nutrient holding qualities. But I'm kind of getting ahead of myself there. So this here is your soil texture diagram. We've talked about this before. There are various ways to go about determining your percent clay, your percent silt, and your percent sand. Once you do those various tests, then you get to look at this triangle and say, oh, after my water was shaken up with my soil in it, that is one of the tests that we talked about, if you remember, getting the soil into water with a little bit of dish soap, shaking that up real good, and watching the sand, silt, and clay settle out over time. And then you're able to determine, oh, I got 20% sand in my soil, and I've got 20% silt in my soil, and then I've got 60% clay in my soil, and you line all of those up and you figure out what kind of soil that you have, your percent, where you fall in the soil texture triangle. Any questions with the soil texture triangle before I go on?
Can I ask a question?
Of course, it's.
How do you intersect 3 lines in a triangle? Do you like your example was whatever 20, 20, 60? Do you follow the like sand 20 up till it meets the silt 20 and then down till it meets the clay 60?
So here, I wish I had a marker on me. Maybe I do. Do I got a marker on me? I got a pointer. So say if we said, what did we say here? We said 20 silt, 20 sand, and 60 clay. So in my head, I would put that about here-ish, 20, 20, 60. Now, that is just me kind of anecdotally kind of going at it. Matt, he's my soil guy. He's a graduate over here. I'm going to put you on the spot. Does that sound about right to you?
Yeah, I think that's about right. You're just moving along the scale wherever, yeah.
Yeah, that's the way I've always understood it.
But okay, sorry, I'll leave it, never mind.
Oh, it's all good. What do you got?
Well, just like where you put your cursor, isn't that more like 40% sand?
See, I would grab a ruler and put one ruler line from 2020, and then another ruler line from. That's how I ended up over here. Does that make sense?
The like arrows go around the triangle, so the 61 would go straight across. The 20 from the silt would go down diagonally, and the 20 from the sand would go up diagonally. And so you're kind of like right in the middle, where it's right where it says clay.
Okay,
right under the word clay.
Gotcha.
They all intersect.
I wasn't seeing the horizontal lines. That makes a lot more sense. Thank you.
Way to go, Aldia. Okay, so we talked about this before, but here's a good diagram showing this. Your comparison size of sand, silt, and clay. That is a good comparison there. That came from someplace online here. I need to look that up if I wanted to find out, but anyway. This is a good comparison. This here is like when you're looking at, if you're looking at sand under a microscope, this here is roughly a sand particle size in comparison to a silt particle size in compared to a minuscule little clay particle size. That way you can see that when you have a bunch of sand particles together making up your soil, there is way more room available for water and air to penetrate into your soil than there is in clay soil. When you have a whole bunch of clay particles together, clay particles tend to be very flat. We'll take a look at that under a microscope here very soon. And they kind of plate on top of each other and stack, and doesn't allow for nearly as much air and water penetration as sandy soil does. Sand particles. So here you take a look at the magnification here. This here is 10 times magnification for sand, 10 times magnification for silt, but clay, you're way up to 1,000 times magnification because of how small it is. Now, if you look at sand particles under the microscope, they are very coarse, very granular, whereas your silt particles are still coarse and granular, but much less so than the sand. And as I was saying about clay, the clay particles end up looking very sheet-like under a microscope. And yeah, take note of the magnification levels in order to determine the different zoom levels here that we're talking about. We were talking about this in our water class a little bit, how the different combinations of soil textures will affect the soil's compactability, air supply, and water holding capacity. Rarely in nature, rarely in a garden, rarely in an ecosystem are you going to have completely uniform soil. Your soil is most likely going to have different textures on it. That is determined, well, you can determine that by digging a soil pit, just basically digging a hole 3-4 feet down, and you can see the different layers in the soil. So the different soil texture layers will affect the soil's compactability, air supply, and water holding capacity. As we've been mentioning, the clay soil particles are stacked on top of each other very closely, and therefore they can be easily compacted with excess moisture or with heavy weights. Now here at Heide's farm, we definitely have clay soil, and at times we have excess moisture, and we definitely have some soil compaction that we've been dealing with and been working our way through so far, and I think quite successfully just in the 2 years that we've been at it. While there are differences between clay types, most clay soils compact very easily and have very low air content, as you can see through that microscope and plate-like qualities of the clay. That severely restricts plant roots and soil biodiversity. On one hand, you got that kind of going against you with clay soils, but it does get better. Now, sand particles are large, as we saw, compared to the clay particles, and there's lots of room for air in between the grains, and therefore sand does not compact easily. And even if you were to purposely compact the sand, it would still have a higher air content than naturally formed clay particles. It's just the difference between the sand and the clay. Now, silt particles are kind of in between the two. They're very much like very small, tiny grains of sand, and they are very light, so much so that they can be suspended in air or water. So if you're doing that water test, the sand settles out very fast, whereas the silt suspends in the water for much longer and then settles out later. The silt, likewise too, if you say are tilling a field under conditions such as we've had in the last week here now, very hot and dry, and if you have a nice gust of wind, it's very possible that that silt will be carried away in the air. So you have to watch out for erosion, air erosion when you have silty soils. Silt are much smaller than sand, and therefore they compact much more readily, but still they'll never become as tight as clay. And again, even compacted silt, purposely compacted silty soils, they have a greater ability to supply air to plant roots and soil microorganisms than your clay soils. And again, it looks like, oh my goodness, we have this clay soil at Heide's farm, what are we going to do? But we'll get back, it has its positives. Clay, as we were saying, holds much more water than sand or silt. Clay has smooth, dense particles, and it creates a greater cohesion effect. Now, we are talking about cohesion and adhesion of water in our water classes. The cohesion effect, the water, that is the tendency for water to stick to other things. So clay, that water will stick to clay much more readily than it will sand or silt. But it sticks to the clay so tight that even though the clay sometimes will look moist, that water is simply just not available to the plants. Much like that straw trick we were talking about, where the drop of water just never leaves that straw. clay is able to hold on to water so tight that it just doesn't leave the clay. Silt holds more water than sand, being smaller particle size than that. But as we were saying, most soils are not uniform, and instead they are a combination of various soil textures. And when you stack various soil textures on top of each other, that influences their water holding capacity, as we were talking about last week. Okay, so now we're going to get into electrical nutrient holding capacity. And so far I've kind of stayed away from this, but now we're going to dive into it a little bit. One way nutrients are held in soil is through electrical charges. And most what are referred to as loose nutrients exist in the soil in the form of electrically charged particles called ions. Positively charged particles are called cations or cations, I've heard them called sometimes, whereas negatively charged particles are called anions. These are very weak electrical charges there. You're not going to get a shock from the ground from any of these kind of things, but it is enough to influence the nutrients in the soil. So we just need to be aware that different soils, so your sand, silt, and clay, will hold different electrical nutrient holding capacity. Sand and silt are comprised mostly of quartz or silicon oxide, and quartz has no electrical charge. Therefore, the ability for sand to attract charged particles is minimal. Whereas clay is made up of silicon and aluminum molecules, and clay particles have many negative charges on each particle, and that it has the ability to attract positive ions, cations. Okay, so here's an example of that. Remember, under a microscope, that those clay soils were very sheet-like, very plate-like, all stacked on top of each other. Now, if we introduce that electrical nutrient holding capacity element, the clay soil, which is this green and blue plate-like structure here, the clay soil has a whole bunch of negative charges on it. And therefore, it is able to attract things in the soil, loose nutrients in the soil, as Heide calls them, that have positive charges. And that is able, the clay is able to attract those nutrients to itself. Now, it's a strange kind of concept, but you guys following me on that one? Any questions on that? Okay, so here is an illustration of two common soil nutrients. You have ammonium nitrate and phosphates, and these are both found in the soil. In the case of ammonium nitrate, it has 4 positive cations. And I'm not a scientist, I'm not going to get down into this too far. This is just an example. And clay, if you remember, has all those negative charges around it. And those negative charges are able to attract the ammonium nitrate to itself. However, phosphate has 6 negative ions associated with it. And clay is not able to attract that phosphate to itself. Clay is able to attract the ammonium nitrate, but not the phosphate. And that's just an example of 2 common soil nutrients. There are many more soil nutrients, of course, in the soil. My point here is clay are able to attract the positive cations to it, where they are not able to attract negative anions to it because clay has that negative charge. Okay. And so here is the different CEC, the cation exchange capacity of different soil types. And if you get a soil test done in your garden or wherever, whatever ecosystem that you're looking at, if you get a soil test done, you will get a report of your cation exchange capacity. Now, the cation exchange capacity is greatly influenced by the humus layer in your soil. So here we have stats about what the average clay loam soil CEC is, and what the average CEC of a sandy soil is. However, if you have a very good humus layer, your CEC is going to be much higher. And that is a way to actually determine how good of a humus layer you have. If you know you have a clay soil, a clay loam soil, let's say, with a cation exchange capacity of 30, but your CEC test comes back from your soil test and it reads like 45, that means you have an excellent humus layer. Likewise, if you have a loamy, sandy soil that you know has a cation exchange capacity of 9, then you get your soil test back and it is above that, then that is a good indicator of a nice healthy humus layer. So what you should note here though is the ability for the different soil types to attract cations to it. And your clay soil will have the greatest ability to attract nutrients to it, way more so than the sandy soil. Heide says that it is the proportion of clay in a soil which determines the electrical nutrient storage capacity of the mineral soil. The proportions of sand, silt, and clay all affect the amount and relative proportions of air and water in the soil and how much water is available to plants, but it's the clay that's going to determine the electrical nutrient storage capacity of the mineral soil. And as we are seeing with the soil texture triangle there, it's very rare, unless it's been manufactured, it's very rare to have soil that is just like 100% sand or 100% silt or 100% clay. That kind of stuff needs some manufacturing, some processing, that is. So if you have a sandy soil, there is going to be some clay in the soil. That clay is going to be what is going to determine the nutrient storage capacity of the soil. Whereas if you have a clay soil, there is still going to be some sand and silt present in the clay soil as well. And as we are seeing with that CEC chart, the clay soil has the most ability to attract nutrients to it. The various proportions of the sand, silt, and clay in that soil, though, all affects the air and water in the soil, which is available to plants and the microorganisms in the soil. So it's important to have all those proportions relatively balanced, given your ecosystem, in order to maintain healthy air and water in your soil for those organisms and plants. Okay, so let's take a bit of a step back now after we had a bit of a soil briefing there. Depending on what we're trying to achieve in our garden or chosen ecosystem, to create the right soil creating the right soil conditions to allow the community of organisms living in the soil, that soil food web, to do their job, to do their various functions in that ecosystem, may involve one of 4 processes. Supplementing missing essential nutrients, providing appropriate organic matter for soil organisms, increasing soil biodiversity, and stimulating biological processes. So we're going to dive into each one of those next. So we're going to start with supplementing missing essential nutrients. And this is too often. Now, hang on, let me go back to this chart here for a second. We had those 4 ways here that Heide has listed to improve your soil. Now, if you remember back in some previous slides there, Heide mentioned in particular, and I wanted to highlight this, that not one of these is any more important than the other one. They are all equally important in order to have healthy soil. We are going to start with supplementing missing essential nutrients here. How often, however, this is often where a lot of new farmers especially begin and end their search. They're just kind of looking to feed the plant and not the whole garden, not the whole ecosystem, not the soil. As regenerative farmers, we're trying to manage that whole ecosystem, that whole garden, trying to manage the soil, not just feed the individual plants. So too often, supplement missing I mentioned there, each one of those four is important for the soil. But we're going to start here with supplementing missing essential nutrients. So each soil, of course, has a different nutrient content. And that nutrient content may or may not be appropriate for the plants that we wish to grow in that area. So it is often necessary to supplement missing essential nutrients while trying to encourage that healthy soil food web. This is particularly applicable to, say, going into a new garden area that maybe was not farmed or not treated as well as you would have liked in the past. And that all those different functions of all those different macro and microorganisms and that healthy soil food web might not be in place. So while we build towards that, which could take a few years, sometimes we need to be able to supplement those missing essential nutrients to our plants. And that is most often accomplished through fertilizers. And so now we're going to jump into some fertilizer terminology, and I've kind of got into a little bit of this with you guys, but we're going to go down this hole a little bit further now. The fertilizer world is a deliberately confusing world. I think it's more to do with kind of trying to take people's money than trying to help them out get the right fertilizers. It is very conventionally skewed fertilizer world. All of the standards were set for the marketing of fertilizers. All of the standards were set back in like the 60s and 70s and 80s when the only thing that was considered fertilizers were conventional fertilizers. So organic fertilizers have some strange terminology applied to them because of marketing standards often, and it's bizarre. And so let's kind of get into this a little bit. There is the International Organization for Standardization, ISO. They define organic fertilizers as carbonaceous material, mainly of vegetable and or animal origin, added to the soil specifically for the nutrition of plants. And just about anything, even man-made synthetic products. Whereas the Soil Sciences Society of America defines organic fertilizers as a byproduct coming from the processes of animals or vegetable substances that contain sufficient plant nutrients to be valued as fertilizers. The FAO says that organic fertilizers are nutrient sources of organic origin, either natural or processed, containing at least 5% of one or a combination of the three primary ingredients, NPK. Now, you'll remember NPK is kind of the conventional standard that was set decades ago as being what fertilizer is, and for some reason it still has stuck around, and that's all that the conventional side concerns themselves with fertilizers, that NPK. So often organic fertilizers are then compared against this NPK standard. If you use this context here from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, organic materials of animal origin such as guano, bat guano, bone meal, fish meal, leather meal are true organic fertilizers, but commonly used sources of nutrients such as manure, slurry, compost, sewage, sludge, and sewage sludge are sometimes not. If the nutrient content is below 5%, they are considered organic amendments. Under the Canadian Fertilizer Act, only products that are solely derived from organic matter may be identified or described as organic. Organic matter is defined as the partially humified remains of plants and animals. In Canada, the following terminology is regulated. That is like the words organic based. If you're using that, if you read that on a bag of fertilizer, it means it must contain at least 15% organic matter. And that's funny. It's a funny number to me because like that means what's the other 85%? If you're using the word natural when fertilizer is sold, That specifically, it's been marketed and regulated to mean that those are materials directly mined from mineral deposits and only subjected to physical processes such as crushing and drying. So we're talking about like things like phosphate rock or green sand, potassium, magnesia derived from ores, potassium from other sources. Here's more terminology. If you read the words on a bag of fertilizer in Canada that says environmentally beneficial, then by law, the producer of that product must identify the rationale for the claim and list all ingredients to allow the customer to assess the validity of that statement. And it's been regulated that words such as balanced and healthy should be avoided on labels because they are often misleading and misunderstood. And also objectionable, the marketing of Canada has listed words such as best or superior or greener as they imply comparisons without indicating the basis of comparison. So these are all the various words that you might see on a bag of fertilizer. But the question here, especially what Heidi asks, is who's really kind of policing all of this? This only works on a complaint basis. So if nobody is out there policing all of it, sometimes it's a bit of a Wild West scenario when you're buying organic fertilizers. And it really falls onto the consumer to know the product and not just kind of trust these bland kind of terms that are being thrown out there. Anytime we talk about, well, again, this here is the Canadian Fertilizer Act here and the Canadian Marketing Act. When they talk about synthetic fertilizers, these are man-made materials derived through chemical processes. So the Canadian Fertilizer Act, it specifically defines organic fertilizers and defines those terms that go along with organic fertilizers that we just went over. But it doesn't define synthetic fertilizers as being distinct from the world of fertilizers in general. All fertilizers, whether it's organic or synthetic or mineral-based fertilizers, are all grouped together under the Canadian Fertilizer Act. And the vast majority of fertilizers listed in the Act are all synthetic fertilizers. So it's very conventionally minded, very conventionally based. Organic fertilizers are kind of like an afterthought to the Canadian Fertilizer Act and not really as regulated and overseen as much as synthetic fertilizers, which are subject to much more rigorous testing. I mentioned mineral fertilizers. When we talk about mineral fertilizers as opposed to organic fertilizers, as opposed to synthetic fertilizers, we're talking about two very different types of products here. One is fertilizers obtained from naturally occurring minerals of non-living origin, such as rocks that have been chemically alterated. Or I can also refer to synthetic or mixed fertilizers, providing a source of minerals including nitrogen. And while nitrogen is not a mineral, it is considered to be mineralized when it's been put into solid forms in the form of nitrates, which are your synthetic fertilizers that are often used in conventional agriculture. Very confusing. Mineral fertilizers can refer to the first one here, where you got rocks that have been ground down, basically rock dust, and that is a certified organic fertilizer that can be used in organic agriculture. Or mineral fertilizers can refer to very synthetic fertilizers, where nitrate is made into a solid form and mineralized. Two vastly different products, but they're both called mineral fertilizers, which again is very confusing. The fertilizer world seems to be deliberately confusing. When we talk about soil applied fertilizers, we are talking about fertilizers that are applied to the soil. And most fertilizers fall into this category. Most fertilizers are applied to the soil surface and then need to be broken down by microbes before they become available to plants. And this is true even for synthetic fertilizers. Synthetic and finely ground materials are converted to plant available form much more quickly than coarse substances. When we talk about foliar applied fertilizers, these are directly absorbed by plant tissues. These are often liquidated in some way or another into a spray, and there's various products available out there. Oh, and we'll go through some of those. And in theory, they should be feeding the beneficial microbial population on plant leaves. There's actually quite a bit of microbes on plant leaves. There's lots of different studies that have been done on this. And when you are applying foliar applied fertilizers, you're trying to feed the microbial population on those leaves. They are best applied in the morning or the evening because that is often when the stomata, those little openings on the underside, usually on the underside of a leaf's surface, are open. And therefore you'll have the greater absorption by the plant. And high nitrogen foliar sprays should be avoided. Those are mostly synthetic. You won't be able to find very many high nitrogen foliar sprays in the organic world. Result in fast vegetative growth, but that growth is often weak. It leaves the plants more susceptible to insects and diseases in the long run. Believe it or not, there are injectable fertilizers out there. Heidi doesn't mince any words. It calls this an abomination arising from an outdated paradigm. And she goes on to say that any concentrated subject injected into a plant's system is toxic. I've never seen or heard of injectable fertilizers myself, but apparently they're out there. Granular and liquid fertilizers. We were talking about foliar sprays, which of course are a liquid fertilizer, but foliar sprays can not foliar sprays, but liquid fertilizers can also be applied to the soil as well. Granular fertilizers take much longer to decompose and to become available to plants than the liquid preparations. As we were saying there a few slides ago, the finer the grind on the fertilizer, the quicker it's going to be absorbed by the ecosystem there. The quicker the microbes will be to digest it and release it to the plants. And we'll get into some of that a little bit later here about how the microbes do their things. Granular fertilizers are always applied directly to the soil. They are often slow release fertilizers, and they're best applied early in the growing season. And we'll get into a few examples of different granular fertilizers here in a minute. Because they are slow release fertilizers, yeah, you want to apply them early in the season and let them do their thing. And liquid fertilizers can be applied, as I was saying, to either the soil or the plant, depending on what you're trying to do. As we were saying before, that it's the soil microbes that are breaking down the fertilizers, even the synthetic fertilizers. The liquid fertilizers are really good to use when it's deemed that there are insufficient soil microbes available to break down the various fertilizers. So as I was saying previous, sometimes you're working with a plot of land that might not have been farmed the way you liked it in the past. There might not be sufficient organic matter in the soil. There might not be all those functioning micro and macro organisms in that soil food web. So you are, in those kind of cases, you're looking to supplement your missing essential nutrients. And here Heidi recommends that liquid fertilizers do a great job for that kind of stuff. And actually on our very first year here at Hayes Farm in 2018, when we started, we did use a lot of what was called Neptune's Harvest, which was a fish extract, a fish emulsion. We were using that in backpack sprayers and spraying fish all over our various plants in our very first year that we were here to help our yields. We've stopped using it since we used it We used quite a bit in 2018. We used the rest of it in 2019, and I decided not to go ahead here in 2020, hoping that our gardens are going to be sufficient after a couple of years of maintaining them and adding compost and all of our organic matter here. Okay, so so far we've been mostly talking about fertilizers. However, there are a lot of, I'm going to call them organic fertilizers in air quotes, that can't be called fertilizers because of the marketing rules and the Fertilizer Act, and therefore they are better known and better sold as soil amendments. So the Canadian Fertilizer Act requires fertilizers to contain certain minimum amounts of plant nutrients. And as I've been saying, these requirements were established decades ago and are mostly geared towards conventional agriculture. And often these requirements are set so high that organic materials, which are typically and historically viewed as fertilizers, such as good composted manures and rock dusts, legally can't be sold as fertilizers. Therefore, under the marketing acts and this and that, instead of calling them fertilizers, they're often sold as soil amendments. All right, so we were talking about percentages of fertilizers, and here this is where the Canadian Fertilizer Act specifies that at least 24% of the weight of a fertilizer must be composed of either nitrogen, phosphorus, or potassium, your NPK. And those are pretty big concentrations, things that aren't often seen in organic agriculture. Here, Heide lists the typical concentration of NPK in plants. And so your average plant is going to have anywhere from, is going to need or going to embody anywhere from 1 to 4% nitrogen, 0.1 to 0.8% of phosphorus, and 0.6 to 0.6% of potassium. Yet when these are applied to the field, sometimes you have those all-purpose fertilizers that are like 10, 10, 10. Your plants don't need that. It's odd that the Canadian Fertilizer Act has never really kind of recognized that yet. I think it all has to do with business and marketing. So as I've been trying to say here, it's kind of nearly impossible for organic fertilizers to meet the requirements of synthetic fertilizers where the bar has been set at. Therefore, they're often sold as soil amendments or specialty fertilizers as opposed to organic fertilizers. Organic fertilizer, if you went into a feed store or whatnot and asked for organic fertilizer, chances are they probably don't have very much, but they probably would have soil amendments or specialty fertilizers. So if you're just looking at the nutrients, that NPK kind of value, especially to anybody that's new to farming and new to gardening, on the surface, it would appear that organic fertilizers don't really provide the value for the money that's spent. You're not going to get that 10, 10, 10 with an organic fertilizer that you would with an all-purpose conventional fertilizer. And that all-purpose conventional fertilizer, such as say Miracle-Gro, is going to be considerably cheaper than any organic fertilizer. So to new growers, this kind of seems like a no-brainer. Why am I going to spend more money on a product that delivers less? But what's not measured or what's not represented through the Fertilizer Act is all the various minerals and other biostimulants, such as enzymes and hormones and vitamins and organic acids that are in those organic fertilizers. The Fertilizer Act just doesn't value those kind of things. There's a whole series of micronutrients that plants need, whereas the Fertilizer Act only really concentrates on those macronutrients. So of course, plants need more than just the NPK for optimal growth. So here's something else that you should be aware of. By law, fertilizers are allowed to be used as vehicles for the disposal of toxic industrial wastes. So there was a slide a little while back where I was saying that at least, I think it was like at least 15% by weight was supposed to be, or maybe it was 24% by weight was supposed to be like your NPK. And then what was the rest of it? What is the rest of that filler in there? And that's what they don't even have to tell you on some of these bags what the rest of that filler is. Now there's a company in Fredericton And I'm not trying to bag on this company. They're called Envirom Organics, and they do what they do, and they run a business. They take, as far as I understand how this company works, they get called in whenever there's sites that need to be remediated. Say there was an oil spill on some land years ago, and that land has just kind of sat as a brown field, as it's called in the industry, and it needs to be remediated before that land can be sold. And a company like Envirom Organics comes in to remediate that land, and they take away those contaminants, and they do what they do, which is a great service, don't get me wrong. But after they're done after they're done dealing with this here, dealing with their different wastes that they're picking up over here, they are allowed to rebag, and after treating it, of course, they are allowed to bag this up and sell it as compost and as fertilizer. And it is compost. They do take the stuff out and they compost it, and they do their thing. But I've heard a lot of people in the organic world saying that they would never order again from Envirom Organics because of different concentrations of heavy metals inside of the compost that are being produced by Envirom Organics. Like I was saying, they do a good service. They go out and rehabilitate land in order to get it productive again, but they are taking that product that they are taking out of there and they are remediating it, and by law it's all allowed and above board, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend their compost. And so you have to be careful about what you're buying when you do buy in compost. Make sure you ask some questions, make sure you know what the origins of that compost is. There are many substances contained in fertilizers and pesticides that are not claimed by the manufacturer to be either nutrients or pesticides. If there is no claim that's made on the product, then there is nothing to regulate. So here's a good example. If you have a Canadian company, this is under the Canadian Fertilizer Act, that is selling organic chicken compost, it doesn't need to list the additions that it has added to that compost, such as tea tree oil or eucalyptus oil, if there is no claim made on the label. Both of those things are often used in the organic chicken world in order to keep health up of the flock and keep the dander down on the litter. And both of these things are antibacterial and antifungal and can be used as insecticides, but they are all allowed under certified organic in the organic chicken world. And therefore, if you're buying compost from a certified organic chicken operation, you could have these kind of things in that compost without absolutely no label, nothing on the label, no claims being made. That just kind of comes along with the compost. So once again, you should be aware of your source of your compost. It's always best to make it yourself, but sometimes you have to order some in, and then you have to be aware as much as you can, because sometimes you can be ordering things in that won't be good for your microbes, even though you're thinking that you're ordering in certified organic compost. Not everything is equal, and the Fertilizer Act doesn't help you to get to the bottom of all this. It's kind of up to you as the consumer. Deliberately confusing world in the fertilizer world. Okay, so yeah, that's that percentage I was looking at when we were saying that a fertilizer must have at least 24% of the weight to be composed of NPK in order to be called a fertilizer. So if you see an all-purpose fertilizer with 10-10-10, it contains by weight 10% nitrogen, 10% phosphorus, 10% potassium. But what is that other 70%? It could be just about anything from just filler like ground limestone or industrial waste, according to Heide Hermery. That industrial waste would have been rehabilitated by a company like Envirom Organics, let's say, but that could end up in your fertilizer. And as I was mentioning about heavy metals in particular, as of right now with the Canadian Fertilizer Act, it is not required to disclose any heavy metals on a bag of fertilizer. The Canadian Food Inspection Agency has regulations in place concerning heavy metals in fertilizers, but they're rarely enforced or policed. So what happens when a soil reaches maximum heavy metal limit? According to Heide here in her book, nobody really knows for sure. In the past, when soils were approaching the maximum allowable limit, the CFIA, that's Canadian Food Inspection Agency, simply increased the maximum limit. You can't really continue to do that too long before we have a problem. Even certified organic soil amendments such as biosolids, some manures, and even some compost can be heavily contaminated with heavy metals. So we're talking about things like copper and lead, zinc, those kind of heavy metals that are often used in the industry, and companies like Environment Organics tries to rehabilitate and take those out of places so that those lands can re-enter the real estate market. But they have to do something with them. And according to what we're reading here, sometimes they end up in fertilizer mixes. Of course, plants do need some of those heavy metals that we're talking about for their health. But if you have too much of those heavy metals, it creates a toxic environment in the soil. And it greatly reduces the microbial populations in the soil, which then will affect the plant health. Eating plants grown in environments high in heavy metals can lead to human health problems too. There's been all sorts of research and articles written on that. Here's one about an urban garden with kale where thallium was present. It was causing human health problems. And also lead and arsenic on leafy greens, again, coming from urban garden kind of centers. So that's something that you need to be aware of. Let's move on to some nitrogen talk here. Despite its abundance in the atmosphere, nitrogen is considered the most limiting nutrient for plant growth. Often when conventional growers are fertilizing, nitrogen is what they're mostly fertilizing with, especially for like say something like a hay crop, because it's often the most limiting nutrient for plant growth, just the one that's just not as available, not as abundant. The most common organic form of nitrogen found in the excretions of larger organisms. The most common form of nitrogen is found in the excretions of larger organisms in ammonium. So we're talking manure here, which is quickly consumed by fungi and nitrifying bacteria. The bacteria then excretes nitrite. That is then consumed by other bacteria who then excrete nitrate. Nitrate is the preferred form of nitrogen for most grasses and crops. And back in our clay slides, I showed a slide of ammonium nitrate molecule. That is something that conventional farmers will fertilize with often, ammonium nitrate pellets, which is a synthetic fertilizer. Man-made, whereas in order to get nitrates into an organic garden, we're looking at that kind of cycle there, part of that food soil web cycle, where excretions from larger organisms, manure, is broken down by fungal activity and bacterial activity. Then that bacteria excretes that, which is then consumed by other bacteria, and then we end up with nitrate in our gardens. That is, of course, not the only way nitrogen gets into our gardens. That's just one way. And we'll talk about more here in a second. In soils that are low in oxygen, such as heavy compacted clay soils here at Hayes Farm, these will contain a large number of denitrifying bacteria. Denitrifying bacteria will take the nitrates that has been formed by those bacteria that we just talked about it, and then they'll convert it back to gaseous forms of nitrogen and oxygen. And that completes the nitrogen, well, it's part of the nitrogen cycle anyway. And so by doing so, by those denitrifying bacteria doing their job, they are taking those nitrates and they're converting it back to oxygen, which is what that heavy compacted soil needs. and that's their function there. But it also, while they do that, it also makes nitrates, of course, less too unavailable to all the plants that need them. As they are converting these nitrates, it's just simply not available to plants. But it is creating oxygen into the soil that the plants need, so it's a bit of a trade-off there. But our job as growers, as farmers here, is to keep adding our organic matter to amend that clay soil, to loosen it up so it's not heavy and compacted, which is exactly what we're trying to do at Hayes Farm through lots of compost addition and lots of organic matter addition. When we first started at Hayes Farm, we definitely had some of these conditions going, the heavy compacted soil, and I would assume these denitrifying bacteria, especially in the Idaho field that we call, which is field block 7. But now, after a couple of years of applying our compost and organic matter and treating the soil well, our soil now is more porous, is able to breathe, and therefore more nitrates are remaining in our soil, and that should be evident by the plant growth. In the nitrogen cycle, nitrogen is never lost, of course. Whether you have a nitrifying event happening where you got the animal droppings and the various bacteria and fungal breaking them down and creating nitrates, or whether you have denitrifying bacteria taking that nitrogen and turning it back into oxygen in the soil. Regardless, nitrogen is never lost. And if the nitrogen balance is correct, this should help feed the organisms in the waterways. And if the nitrogen is excessive, then the waterways will become polluted, and huge amounts of nitrogen can become locked deep into the soil. Now, I know in southern Ontario, down like Essex, there's a lot of farming that's done on silt plains. And a lot of conventional farming, and a lot of nitrogen has been applied. Then I've read articles about just like vast resources of nitrogen being contained in the sub-layers of the soil. And there are people that are trying to figure out how to tap into those layers of nitrogen and be able to bring them back out, because right now they're kind of trapped, but they're never lost. They're just kind of trapped in the soil through excessive nitrogen use. When Heide, I was mentioning about microbes breaking down soil, or breaking down fertilizers, even synthetic fertilizers. Heide goes into great detail in her book about specific types of synthetic fertilizers and how they affect the soil, and their effects to soil life. So ammonium sulfate and ammonia nitrate and various forms of urea, dolomite lime, potassium chloride, triple super phosphate. These are all various synthetic fertilizers that are used. And they all contain various amounts of sulfur. Sulfur is often used as a coating to slow down the release of nitrogen, so it's not leached away in the waterways and it's not locked down deep into the soil. Sulfur is often used as a coating, so the nitrogen dissolves more slowly or is taken up more slowly by the soil. But all of these things, all of these various types of synthetic fertilizers, all contain these are all very common fertilizers, very often used in conventional farming. They all use sulfur in their composition. The sulfur, when you expose it to water in the soil, it produces sulfuric acid and creates a toxic environment that kills soil life. Now, compare that against organic fertilizers. There are various, first we'll get into some mineral fertilizers here. And there are all sorts of various mineral fertilizers. that will provide large boosts to your garden or ecosystem. Heide cautions that large amounts of any single nutrient applied to the soil can create a lot of damage to plants in the soil, and they should be used with care. Even if they are certified organic fertilizers, you always need to be able to use them with care, because any large amounts of a single nutrient can create damage in the soil. There are various calcium sources here that Heide has listed, and we'll get into some various other ones here. Does anybody have any experience with any of these, or want to talk about any of these a little bit further? Maybe lime. Let's talk about lime a little bit further, especially here in Atlantic Canada. I use lime here at the Hayes farm, and I use lime at home. There is a great article out there. There is a great article out there by some Dalhousie University professors. It's called Atlantic Canada Soils Need Lime, very blunt, and I think it's a great article to look up. But anytime you use lime, you still need to be able to, you don't want to over-apply anyway. I've been told by various farmers over the years that it's impossible to over-apply lime. But the lime that we purchase, whether it's from the feed store or from like a place like Scott's Nursery or any place like that, there are basically two different types of lime. There's a calcium lime, and then there is a magnesium lime called the dolomitic lime. And you're not just getting the ground limestone, but you're also either getting the calcium along with it or the magnesium along with it. And that will both affect the soil in various ways. And I'll follow Heide's advice here, and they should all be used with care. Does anybody want to discuss any more of these calcium sources? Okay, here are some carbon sources. Often it comes back down to compost. Here we're talking about compost, humic and fulvic acid, molasses and sugars. I'm thinking I'm going to go through these a little bit quick here. Stay with me. I'm just checking the time. I got about 20 minutes left. I'm just going to go through a little bit these a little bit quick. Epsom salts on tomatoes. I've been on the fence about that one a little bit. I think I'm back on board. We used some on our tomatoes there this year. Tomatoes, much like strawberries, any kind of fruiting plant that has, any kind of plant that produces fruit, let's go with that, needs magnesium in order to make the cell walls on those plants proper anyway, to be, I forget exactly how it was explained to me, but magnesium is very important for fruiting plants. Dolomitic lime and Epsom salts will apply that, will be a source of magnesium for that. Heide cautions on the Epsom salts because of the salt end of things, but I think used in the right proportions, just a small little dash will certainly help your tomatoes. A common problem with tomatoes is blossom end rot, and that is a black spot on the blossom end of your tomatoes, and that is often corrected with magnesium and calcium too. So some common organic fertilizers that are available out there, effective microorganisms, which are super interesting, and we'll talk about those in a second. Various kelp products, ocean water, sea-derived minerals, and rock dust. Ocean water I find fascinating, especially since we live here in Atlantic Canada. Heide says that an application of ocean water at basically 1/2 to 1 liter per 1/3 cubic foot of soil can last up to 5 years. For the benefits, can last up to 5 years. A lot of people are concerned about the sodium involved in ocean water, but she claims that the sodium in combination with all of the other minerals found in ocean water is not toxic to plants or soil organisms. I know, I think I've talked about this before, that hay crops that are grown along the ocean are sold at a premium. There are usually very nutrient dense crops, and the animals that eat them usually really prefer them, because I've been told, because of the salt spray that's on them too. But the salt spray certainly does go a long way to feeding the soil if everything that Heidi tells us here is correct. I've always been surprised about that ocean water one, and most people are, but I'd really like to give that a try one day in a small little plot. It'd be nice to be able to see how that goes. So as far as nitrogen fertilizers, we were saying that nitrogen is the most limiting factor in most soils. So nitrogen is often something that does need to be boosted, especially if you're on a new garden plot that hasn't been farmed so well in the past. Here she lists all different sources of nitrogen. What's interesting here is that on synthetic fertilizers, you can easily get a synthetic fertilizer that is 20% nitrogen, maybe even higher than that. But look at all these organic sources. Rarely do you hit that 20% of nitrogen, except for dried packaged manures, which basically is a concentrated product. Even your fresh manures are going to be lower than that 20%. So some of the higher percentages of nitrogen is your blood meal, your feather meal. Hair is interesting, and I've used sheep trimmings there in the past as mulch, and they make fantastic mulch. And apparently they also provide quite a bit of nitrogen for the soil. Does anybody have any experience using any of these different fertilizers, nitrogen or organic nitrogen fertilizers?
I believe Joey used blood meal.
For what?
In his soils, he's growing his plants.
Blood meal is especially good for roses and flowering plants. Yeah.
It was marijuana plants.
Yeah, flowering plants. There you go.
Yeah.
Ain't no shame in that. It's all legal. But yeah, these various organic nitrogen amendments. I know Kathy Boone at Little Eden Organics, she often uses the alfalfa meal, which is something I haven't used myself, but yeah, that's something she likes to use. Guano is something I have used. What I don't find on this list is vermicastings, vermicompost. I'm wondering what that is here, but that's okay. Does anybody want to discuss any of these further before we keep kind of going on here? Phosphorus fertilizers. Now, what's interesting about phosphorus is lately it's been proven, a whole new, within the last decade or so, a whole new school of thought on phosphorus is that whereas we've been saying that nitrogen is often the most limiting nutrient in the ecosystem, a deficiency in phosphorus will result in a deficiency of all of the nutrients. So phosphorus is involved in the transportation of nutrients within a plant. So if the phosphorus isn't present, the plant won't be able to pick up and move nutrients within the plant itself. Despite the fact that nitrogen is the most limiting nutrient in the ecosystem, even with a sufficient amount of nitrogen, it's not going to do anything if you are phosphorus deficient. So phosphorus is very important there for plants. Some organic sources of phosphorus here are listed. Yes, and phosphorus in conventional chicken manure. Conventional chicken manure, whether it is for meat birds or egg-laying birds, aluminum is often used in keeping down the dander, the dust and the dander inside of those areas for the lungs, not only the chickens, but the workers that are working in there. There is often an amendment of some sort of aluminum compound in order to keep all that dander and dust down. That aluminum compound will bind with the phosphorus, and if you're using conventional chicken manure as an amendment for compost or in your soil or whatnot, you have to be aware that sometimes the aluminum that is used inside of that chicken manure can bind that phosphorus to make it unavailable for your plants. So again, you should be aware of the sources of your compost and different fertilizers that you're importing into your garden area. Potassium here, we got NP, and now we're moving on to the K. In the organic fertilizer world, if you're looking for a potassium boost, you're looking at dried packaged manures, potassium sulfate, or green sand. Green sand is interesting. I'm not sure if I've talked about that enough yet. Green sand lately has been hard to come by. I used to use green sand quite a bit, but apparently there's a bit of a green sand shortage in Canada at the moment. I've stopped using it, but I don't know where that stands currently. I don't know if you can get your hands on green sand right now. Green sand is kind of like diatomaceous earth. It is a sand or sandstone with a greenish color, and it originates from ancient shallow marine sediments. And it has noticeable quantities of rounded greenish grains. And in the past, painters have used it for green color for their palette. And now it's often used in organic gardens. It is a slow release fertilizer, so it's best applied early in the season, and it is high in potassium. Now we're getting into some micronutrients. If you're looking for some sulfur for your garden, here are some different sources of sulfur. Adding sulfur will lower your pH, just so that you're aware of that, whether it's for good or for bad. It is slightly, sulfur can be acidifying and should be used with care. Okay, so we spent a lot of time there on supplementing missing essential nutrients, because that's often where people kind of begin and end their working with soil. And instead of just feeding the plant, though, we should also be looking at providing appropriate organic matter for all of the soil organisms in your garden or in your ecosystem. Organic matter feeds the soil organisms. We've talked about that quite a bit so far. Organic matter will also protect against soil compaction, erosion, and water evaporation. Soil organisms pre-digest and transform organic matter into all kinds of substances that are then easily absorbed by the plants. It's not the compost that is feeding the plants, it's the compost that's feeding the soil organisms that are then feeding the plants. As with our previous kind of category there with supplementing missing essential nutrients, we're going to go through a list of some common microfoods, which is kind of also known as organic matter. So you have nature's own mulch, and that is using fallen leaves from the ecosystem, very agroecology approach, and or tree trimmings on the soil surface, and using the spent leaves and flowers from your own gardens as mulch in your perennial beds. Whenever you mow the grass, leave the grass clippings on the lawn, leaving crop debris to decay on the fields. You can see as you're working in your field blocks, all of the stuff that was left over from the fall of last year that I have deliberately not cleaned up. I have deliberately left it in the gardens in order to behave as mulch. It all kind of came from the soil, and it's all going to return to the soil. Basically, it's a replicating of a natural ecosystem. Pros here, it's quick and cheap, and it can increase biodiversity in the garden. Cons here is that if you're using leaves and or twigs from trees, say in the area, some trees do produce growth inhibiting toxins. Black walnut is a great example. And some mulch simply just can't stay where it is. And you guys have seen that in your field lot where, say if you're planting, if you're going to double crop an area, sometimes you need to get rid of whatever that previous crop was. And you also, if you're going to collect mulch from the area, say like grass clippings, you got to be aware of introducing weed seeds into the garden as well, if you're going to use something like that. But in general, I try to leave all of my garden waste in the garden. If you're growing, say, pepper plants, it's nice to be able to harvest your peppers, but then leave the plants in the garden as much as possible to then return to the garden. Sometimes it simply can't stay where it is, whether you're double cropping or whatever you're going to be doing in that bed. Then that stuff ends up in the compost. And then in theory, that compost is then, later used on your gardens again. So it's a whole replicating self-circle kind of thing. Leaf mold, we talked about leaf mold before. We got a bit of leaf mold happening on some bags of leaves beside our compost pile. We're talking about large piles of leaves or just simply bagged leaves that are coarsely chipped, piled into windrows. That's for the large piles. Or you can just do it in micro scale just inside of one of those yard waste bags. You allow that to ferment for months. You could perhaps turn it, you don't necessarily need to. It's an anaerobic digestion and it produces yeasty smells. It makes a very fungal rich environment and it can make an excellent mulch, especially for any woody kind of plants. Your woody plants, your raspberries, your shrubs, your apple trees, cherry trees, that kind of stuff. They love high fungal environments because that's what naturally would be in their ecosystem. That tree, that shrub or whatever would drop its leaves, drop bits of its branches and that kind of stuff, which would get taken up by different fungal and bacterial activity and returned as fertilizer to that tree. Very fungal rich environment. Pros of leaf mold is makes a great mulch. It's much more porous than just straight leaves that can kind of stack on top of each other and plate a little bit and not allow so much water and air penetration. The cons here, this is according to Heide here, is that the leaves are best left right where they fall to protect the soil against heavy rain, prevent soil erosion, provide habitat for insects and small animals, and to insulate plant roots against the cold, because that's exactly what leaves do for trees and the forest ecosystem. So if we do take those leaves away and put them onto our gardens, we are kind of robbing that ecosystem of its own mulch in and of itself. Ramial chipped wood is super interesting to me. It's kind of well known that wood chips make bad mulch for your garden because, well, exactly this last point here, sawdust and wood chips in your garden should be avoided as they tie up nitrogen without giving much benefit in return. But when we talk about ramial chipped wood, we're talking about using just the trimmings here of trees, ideally deciduous trees. And they provide great amounts of foods for fungi and increase your fungal biodiversity. Hardwood branches are best. They should be uncomposted and free from leaves. So here, if you picture like a forest ecosystem, the things that a tree will drop onto the forest floor are its leaves, and sometimes it's smaller branches and twigs and that kind of stuff. Whereas rarely does the bark or the trunk or the bigger, thicker branches get dropped. Sometimes it does, of course, but not half as often as the leaves and the smaller branches of the trees. Those leaves and smaller branches of the trees has been proved to have a different chemical component than the thicker tree trunks and the bark. The thicker tree trunks and the bark will tie up your nitrogen and not give much benefit in return. But those leaves and those small twigs and everything else like that, they break down much easier and they provide a very rich fungal activity for your soil. Compost, what time do we got? Time check, we're almost getting close to time. I'm gonna run over just a little bit, but I always do, so hang in there. Compost. always comes back down to compost. So as we were saying, like that 4 foot, 3 foot compost pile that we kind of got going here at the farm doesn't really exist in nature. Nature does compost, but well, Heidi says nature does not compost, but it decays instead. And so you'll get that happening in the forest. You get layers in the forest, but not like quite the same as we do in our compost pile. Composting, as we were saying, is a man-made process credited to this Albert Howard fella who was in India at the time. The whole purpose of compost is to breed microbes. And so therefore the compost pile needs the right amount of air and water for all of those microbes to thrive. Microbes then digest the organic matter much faster than would naturally happen in nature. And the end result is a very fine compost that's high in organic matter and high in nutrients. Now, if you are dealing with municipal compost, you have to be careful. They're not so selective of what they take in. The municipal compost goal is more to deal with all of this excess organic matter that happens in a municipality, not necessarily to make the best compost as a final result for gardeners. So you have to be cautious there when taking in municipal compost. Anytime pesticides are present in compost, they can take years to break down. A fine-tuned municipal compost system can make compost in as little as 2 weeks, which is incredible. However, in the US, measurable amounts of many pesticides have been found in municipal composts, including all the various ones that you see there, and there's Roundup there that's on the list as well. And another word on municipal compost here too, especially here in Freddie, is you got to watch out on those flooding years too. You can end up with a lot of contaminated organic material that gets collected and put into the compost. Again, the municipality is more interested in cleanup than a final compost that is great for gardeners. Their goal is to be able to clean up the city, not to produce compost for gardeners here. So you got to be careful with municipal compost. And so there's various other things that can be added to compost, whether municipal compost or say a company like Environ that does composting services that take a very long time to break down, such as your heavy metals and your industrial waste and your pesticides and toxins and even pharmaceuticals. And sewage sludge is sometimes added to compost too on an industrial level. So we got to be careful about that. This one here, I think I've talked about this before on the composting lecture, but it's worth mentioning again. Diseased plant material, traditionally, it was always thought that that should be removed from your garden ecosystem altogether and even burned in order to destroy any diseased plant material. Heidi, though, disagrees with this. She claims that the compost pile is the ideal environment to breed predators of disease-causing organisms. The disease won't spread if it doesn't have a food supply for it. Typically, a plant disease will attack a living plant. Typically, a plant disease doesn't attack dead plants in your compost. Whereas when you add that diseased plant to your compost, it's going to create almost an inoculant against that plant disease. And then when you spread your compost around your farm with those microbes, you're basically trying to inoculate your farm. Very, very interesting approach to composting plant disease material in your compost. Yeah, we talked about this here in the composting class. Peat and coir is another organic matter to feed soil organisms. When we talk about peat, we're talking about the woody remains of partially decomposed bog plants. There are many different types of peat out there, all with different organic matter content, different nutrient content, and different water holding capacities and different pHs. Peat is often used as a soil amendment in a sterile medium for seedlings and planters. And sterile is in big quotes there because it is not sterile. Peat, of course, just like any other substance that you would get from nature, contains different types of microbes. Those microbes are almost never mentioned on any packaging or labeling. And those microbes that are commonly found in stagnant peat moss include all of those various ones. And they interact with your soil and can sometimes suppress bacteria in the soil. So even though stagnant peat moss is sold and considered to be a sterile medium, you got to be aware that it does contain its own microbes. I'm going to skip past that one. And as we were mentioning before, this is what I wanted to get to here, there is a lot of environmental concern about the exploitation of peat bogs. That always should be mentioned anytime we talk about peat. Less than 5% of peat bogs are restored after harvesting, and peat bogs are important carbon sinks and regulators of water flow. So watch out for buying in too much peat. Heide Hermery there advises using compost over peat. It is very difficult though to find a compost-based potting soil. I have never seen one available just at the stores. They're almost always peat-based compost or potting soils. Yeah, and I agree with Heidi though, if you could use compost instead, it would be great, but hard to find. Coir, when we talk about coir, that's a waste product of coconut production. It is a great source of organic matter, but offers little to no nutrients or disease suppression qualities. Your compost will offer disease suppression qualities. And coir, at least in the Canadian perspective, is shipped from far, far away. Using an agroecology approach, coir probably isn't the best product to be using. Bark mulch is often used as organic matter for gardens and this kind of thing. But as we were talking about with the ramial chipped wood, the breakdown of hardwood material will tie up your nitrogen and provide very little benefits for your soil, and produces humic and fulvic acids, which are usable and useful to plants. Yeah, so hang on, let me take a step back there. Yeah, you have to watch out for your bark mulch will tie up nitrogen. However, after it's done tying up that nitrogen, like I'm talking like years later, and this is one of the reasons I have mulch, wood chips, which is made up of bark and bigger branches around the hoop house, is because eventually they will break down over time. I'm talking like 3, 4, 5 years into the future, and it will be quite nutritious. But in between, it's going to tie up nitrogen and will actually stunt plant growth in that area, which I'm using to my advantage. I want the plant growth to be stunted in that area, and bark mulch will do a good job at that. And then eventually it will release these humic and fulvic acids, which are both usable and useful to plants. I'm gonna skip ahead a little bit. Wood chips, yeah, much like the bark mulch, they will tie up nitrogen as well. But then eventually, and wood chips and bark mulch, if applied too thick, can mat and inhibit air exchange with soil and water infiltration. They can also increase the temperature because as they compost, they are breaking down and increasing temperature, and it can become too hot for some plant roots. Sawdust is another one. Sawdust is not recommended. Sawdust is best applied lightly in the compost. It will bind the nitrogen in year 1, but release it in year 2. Yeah, straw and hay. This is what I wanted to get to because we use a lot of straw around the farm. Hay is a highly nutritious mulch. Does anyone know why it's not used more often in the garden?
Is it because it's like messy?
It wouldn't be any more messy than straw, but that is a reason people don't use it. Don't use hay or straw sometimes, especially in an ornamental garden.
It can have seeds from other plants in it, right? Or
Yeah, all sorts of seeds. The seeds are good for the animals that eat it, protein and this and that. But hay is typically, whereas straw, say if you have a field of barley, a field of wheat, a field of oats, a combine will run through and harvest that barley or oats or wheat, and then all you're left with are just the sticks of the plant. That is your straw, and all the seeds have been removed. Hay is a crop of grasses, various sorts, and maybe some other things in there. And the whole thing is harvested from the ground and baled up into round bales or square bales, and it has all those seeds in it. And both hay and straw can make very highly nutritious mulch, except hay, when you're bringing hay into your garden, you're going to be introducing a ton of seeds into your garden. Now straw, though, I wanted to mention, I don't think I've mentioned this yet, straw is allelopathic, which means it will inhibit the growth of plants and can inhibit seed germination. So when you use straw, you got to keep that in mind. You could use that to your advantage and put straw in an area where you don't want things to germinate, your weeds, for example, and it will inhibit the germination of those weeds up to a point, not forever for sure, but for a couple of weeks. But given the fact that it is allelopathic, why do you think we still use it at Hayes Farm? Or maybe we should be thinking about how it's used at Hayes Farm. When does our straw come in? When you guys came here in the spring, all of the beds were well covered with straw. And we haven't ordered yet, you haven't seen any more straw come in, right? Nope. We apply all of our straw here at the farm in the fall. And we allow it to do its allelopathic effect. That effect doesn't last the entire longevity of the straw. That effect only lasts for the first several weeks that it's applied. So we apply all of our straw in the fall, we let it do its thing, we let it kind of semi-decompose over the winter and into the spring, and by the time we're ready to use it in the spring, it doesn't have much problem here for us. So you got to watch out your timing when applying straw to the garden. And just like you got to be careful of your sources of compost, you got to be careful of your sources of straw. Spraying crops with Roundup just a couple of days before harvest, believe it or not, is a normal practice in conventional agriculture. They do this in order to kill your whatever crop that they're about to harvest. It might be corn, it might be barley, it might be wheat, it might be soy, it might be whatever. Conventional farmers will spray it with Roundup before harvesting. That way the plants, when they harvest it through their combine, the plants will be dead and almost crispy. And then those seeds will get removed by the combine that much more quickly, that much more effectively. So it's a common practice to spray Roundup on a crop before harvesting. And that, of course, is going to be residual on the straw that is left over. And any straw bedding that contains fresh animal manures should be treated the same as fresh manures and not applied to the garden fresh. Now, last year, we received a load of straw bedding from Frex after the exhibition was done. We applied this in the fall and then allowed the fall, winter, and spring for that manure to decompose and start composting it just in the garden. And that is an acceptable organic practice for applying manures like that. Okay, so we talked about missing essential nutrients. We talked about applying appropriate organic matter for soils. We had two more categories to go over, which I'm not going to get into now because we're over time here. But these slides, I have shared all the slides available with you. If you wanted to go take a look at the slides, you are very welcome to do so. I also have that Heide Hermery book with me now, and I'm going to leave it at the farmhouse. And if anybody wants to take a deeper dive into that Heide Hermery book, it's there. But just kind of worth mentioning, if you're working with your soil, besides supplying those missing essential nutrients, besides providing more organic matter for your soil organisms, you can also work with your soil by increasing the soil biodiversity. And there's different amendments here that Heide lists, from compost and manures and plant extracts and compost leachate, fermented compost tea and various manure extracts are all listed here in the book. Oh, and effective microorganisms, which are very interesting stuff, and you guys should look into those. Yeah, I won't get into that now. And then the final one here is all about stimulating biological processes, the natural biological processes of an ecosystem. You're just trying to stimulate them a little bit more through proper management of air, through proper management of water resources, and some seaweed products and plant hormones are also recommended to stimulate biological processes. And rock dusts as well will help stimulate those biological processes. And then that takes us to the end of Heide's book.